Please pretend you're hugging me so I can escape." The voice was no louder than the rain. It fit into the sleeve of his coat like a secret. A small hand found the hem and held on with a grip that had the urgency of someone who had already learned the language of danger. Gabriel Mercer looked down. The girl was 7, maybe 8. Rain-dark hair plastered to her cheeks, nose freckled, shoes too thin for winter. Her coat smelled faintly of bleach and the stale metallic tang of institutional air. She did not meet his eyes. Her spaced-out stare was practiced, old enough to know how to look afraid without collapsing, young enough that everything still hurt like thunder inside. He could have walked away. He had learned to be invisible. Years of living under other people's expectations had taught him how to make himself small in a room full of hungry cameras and louder voices. But when her fingers tightened, something in him moved before thought. Maybe it was a reflex left over from a lifetime of reacting without calculation, an athlete's body remembering balance and protection when it mattered. Maybe it was something softer, an old promise he had made to himself after the one thing he couldn't protect. He bent and gathered her into his arms without ceremony. She fit against him like a piece of a life he hadn't known he could hold. Outside, the rain hissed against the streetlight. The city blurred into a watercolor of headlights and neon. For a moment there was no season, no headline, no stadium chant, only the little chest under his jaw, the tiny reins of breath pressed against his collarbone. She kept her face buried. Her next words slipped into his shirt, quick and urgent. "They'll think I'm with you," she whispered. "Please, say you're my daddy. Say you're my husband. Say you'll take me to a hotel. Please." Gabriel swallowed. The girl, her name, she would later tell him, was Leela, spoke with the sharp logic of children who have learned how adults make rules and how to weaponize the loopholes. Hankering for a husband was not the point. A husband meant safety and paperwork, a face who might be trusted when her own was not. He thought of how little separated this moment from other public displays he'd been forced into. Fans hunting for autographs, cameras catching the curl of his smile. Here, anonymity was life. Fame could kill a rescue. "Okay," he said, a single syllable, firm. He took her to the corner shelter, where the night manager let them in without asking too many questions. He paid cash for 2 rooms under a different name, Daniel Hart, the only name he ever used in quiet places now. He tucked Leela into a bed, made sure she ate, wrapped her in towels, kept his voice plain and unremarkable so she would not be able to fashion fame into a story she could not fold into the truth. He left the key with instructions. Stay put. Don't open the door unless it's himself or a woman with a red coat. At 3 in the morning, he sat on the floor by the window and watched the rain make the city soft and anonymous. He went through his mind the way athletes go through plays in their head when lying awake, step by step, every contingency catalogued. He would be careful. He had to be. The woman who would come to define his next months, Claire Whitaker, arrived the next morning at the shelter with a mug that trembled in her fingers. She smelled faintly of cinnamon and flour. When she smiled, it looked like a small, reluctant sunrise. She was not a social worker. She was not a bureaucrat. Claire ran a small community kitchen and a daytime shelter for people who had nowhere else. She had a cautious kindness that came from living with practical loss. She carried a folder of emergency forms and a thumbed photograph of a boy in a baseball cap who had once been her husband, knocked away in a single page of hospital records. She told the story in fragments: accident, a funeral read by a tightly folded program, sleep stolen by the constant sound of someone else's grief. And when Gabriel watched her, he felt the tilt of 2 different kinds of sorrow leaning into the same light. He introduced himself as Daniel Hart, compact, ordinary, a name that would not dress him in bright colors. He said he had found Leela at the bus stop and panicked. He said he would help. He did not say that people knew his face in places Claire did not go. He did not say that his body still remembered a stadium's roar in the hollow of his ribs, or that there were trophies the size of small mansions locked away in temperature-controlled rooms he did not open. That would have been the easiest way to make her trust him,
to make her drop her questions and let him carry the truth in broad gestures. But he wanted another kind of trust, one not bought with celebrity, one earned by midnight bowls of soup and the slow, patient learning of a child's name. "Her name is Leela," the girl told Claire that afternoon when the big woman with flour on her hands crouched down and looked at her like she mattered. Leela's hands were dry now. She smoothed the edge of the blanket like someone reassembling a map to a lost town. Claire's voice calmed her, touched the part of the world that remembered safety in a measured tone. For the first time since she had let her fingers into Gabriel's coat sleeve, Leela allowed herself to be small without bracing. Gabriel watched them in the kitchen corner where he washed dishes because he preferred being useful to being thanked. He had a watch that beeped for morning workouts and a knee that twinged if he sat too long. He slept in a different room from the one he paid for. The keys were tucked under a bed of a motel he rented under a third name. Old habits die reluctantly. He kept his sleeping life apart from this patchwork family he was weaving with lint and second-hand blankets.
Claire accepted the story. A stranger rescued a child and would help until the paperwork could be straightened. The shelter coordinated with the nearest child services intake. The woman there, soft-voiced, professional, said the child came from a facility run by the county and would be placed in temporary care pending investigation. Gabriel watched the exchange like a man watching a chessboard. Lila clung to Claire for a while. The woman asked Lila simple things: favorite color, pet names, something that would let an adult imagine a family and assign her a place inside it for a few hours. Lila answered in short bursts. When asked if she wanted to see a counselor, her jaw tightened. "No," she said, "I just want them to think I'm with my husband." Daniel, Gabriel, offered to be a witness. He had no right to be part of the process, but he knew how systems bent when there was a face to stand on the record who didn't fit any of the expected categories. He wrote his alias on a consent form and signed his real name only in the small notebook he kept in his sock drawer, the one the woman who set his training schedule and the lawyer who knew his real life kept tributes to. He would be on record as someone willing to take temporary custody if needed. He would do it without a flash or a mention of stadium lights. He would do it on the quiet side of everything. The first night in the hotel room, Claire made tea and sat on a chair that wobbled. She shared a bowl of soup with Lila and asked questions like a sympathetic first responder. "Do you remember your home? Do you remember your parents' voices?" Questions that always required too much memory for a child who had learned the economy of forgetting. Lila answered with pragmatic details: locked doors, loud footsteps, the smell of bleach. She did not speak of beating. The girl's language turned cruelty into logistics, possibly because naming it might make it more true. Gabriel listened from the doorway. He had learned to listen like an investigator, like a man who had spent a career reading defensive moves and predicting trajectories. His advantage was not in being loud, but in knowing how to be precise. He kept to small gestures: a bandage pressed to a skinned knee, a coat folded neatly over a chair, an extra pillow for the child to wedge against during nightmares. At night, he would sit on the other side of the door and listen to Claire read a book aloud. Her voice was rough in parts, a warmth that did not ask for repayment. Lila drifted to sleep with her hand tucked into the crook of Claire's wrist. Gabriel felt unmoored and right at the same time. Within 48 hours, a single fact altered the geometry of the little plan they'd drawn with such hopeful naivete. The facility Lila had escaped from was not just a poorly run county shelter. It was a node in a network that had a capacity for cruelty. The intake worker used a careful phrase, reported irregularities, and held up a tablet screen showing redacted documents. Claire and Gabriel sat on opposite sides of a coffee table that smelled of strong soap and older secrets, while the worker told them the kind of bureaucracy story every single person dreads. Invoices in the wrong name, children registering under aliases, accounting entries that suggested third-party payments with no clear source. Gabriel felt a muscle in his jaw tick.
He was not inclined to lawyering, but he was good at reading when a play had been called. He had a roster of people he trusted to move in the spaces between public spectacle and private action. He tapped a number in the phone that lived under his sleeve. Mara, his assistant of many habits, who knew enough to be dangerous and enough to be loyal, and asked her to bring contacts, quietly. Mara appeared that afternoon, a wind of efficient calm who never asked inconvenient questions in front of a child. She knew his real name. She had been with him when he retired, when the lights receded, and he needed someone to handle the last vestiges of fame. She arrived with a woman he had asked her to find. Mira Serrano, licensed private investigator, a person with a police clearance and a taste for documents. Mira's face was kind in the way that steady things are kind. She had been the kind of woman who made enemies on behalf of truth and then padded them with court filings. Mira rubbed her palms, not unkindly, and opened a laptop. Claire watched them with an expression that was mostly relief and partly suspicion. Gabriel could not blame her. A stranger arriving with a laptop and quiet competence felt like the second act of a story that often had a darker ending. But when Mira clicked through spreadsheets, scanned red-flagged payments, and pulled geotagged photos of small clusters of children in the parking lots of the facility, Claire's breath came out in a long string. "They call it a foster consolidation," Mira said, "packing children through short-term contracts, routing payments through shell accounts. When the numbers don't add up, profit is the only explanation left." She tilted the screen toward them and then closed it. "There are two ways to handle this: quietly, with evidence forwarded to the right people, or loudly. Loud is messy but sometimes necessary. But you don't want a family exposed in the middle of it." Gabriel thought instantly of cameras and headlines, of children recognized by faces and turned into talking points. He thought of the stadium lights and the cheering crowd that had once separated him from anonymity. He compared the two kinds of exposure and chose the one that preserved the little sanctuary under Claire's roof. "We keep this quiet," he said. "We gather evidence and go to authorities who can act. No public announcements, no footage that a newsroom can play 1,000 times." Mira nodded.
"You can't single-handedly push this without creating a target. We'll need counsel, someone who can take chain of custody evidence and challenge the institution legally. We'll need a psychologist to speak credibly about the children's needs, and we need someone to look at the financials at scale." Gabriel thought Jonah Elias. He had known Jonah years ago when Jonah was a reporter who still believed in the idea that a good story could change a city. Jonah had lost the freshness that came with early idealism, but kept the instincts, which were rarer. He had worked as an investigative journalist on corruption beats and still whispered when he called him, "I know people." Gabriel dialed the number. Jonah's voice on the other end was cautious but quick. There was a curiosity that didn't betray his professional hunger. "I'll follow the thread," Jonah said, "but you have to trust me on one thing. If this becomes a story that can help other kids, I will consider the ethical angle. We'll anonymize names, we'll work with counsel, but we need to move fast. Once papers are subpoenaed, things get messy." Gabriel agreed. He laid out the precaution that had become his religion: no photos with faces, no interviews with Claire or Leela in public, and any press releases to be coordinated through a spokesperson who would be nameless. He wanted the children to remain children, to heal under blankets, without their faces being flattened into headlines. The first act of the investigation was small and surgical. Mira gained access to a discarded ledger from a night janitor who had kept a curious habit of saving invoices. The ledger had names, dates, and amounts wired to an account that did not belong visibly to the facility. Jonah pulled 3 sources of public records and cross-referenced them with property deeds. Slowly, the map of what had looked like a single bad shelter began to sprawl into a network. Another home under a different corporate name, a contracted transportation company that scheduled busing at odd hours, a small private clinic that claimed to provide pediatric evaluations but had very little documentation. Throughout this, Gabriel's life became modular. He trained at dawn alone, moving through drills that kept a body that once dominated a field in shape for moments when strength would be necessary. He did not train for spectacle.
He trained to be capable. He kept the trophies out of mind, hidden away in whatever was the opposite of a museum, in a storage unit whose number belonged to a trust in the name of a charity most had never heard of. Those trophies were not to be used to buy credibility. They were to remind him of a past he could not impose on a child who had been taught to fear men with loud reputations. At night he listened to Leela practice words in a notebook Claire had given her. Guardian, she wrote one evening in purple ink, then circled the word as if testing its edges. Temporary followed, with a small, uneven underline.
Gabriel sat on the floor and traced the letters with the pad of his finger, without looking like he was reading. He had not thought of himself as a guardian in a long time, not in the way the word implied, someone who built a small constancy around fragile things. But as the days folded into a pattern of hospital checks, interviews, and clandestine calls, he felt the role as if it were something his muscles remembered how to do. "Why don't you tell her?" Claire asked once, as they walked the children to a nearby park under the pale wash of winter sun. Leela ran ahead, chasing pigeons like tiny, pulsing doubts that scattered easily. Claire's eyes flicked to Gabriel's hands, calluses, the faint scar along his knuckle, and then back to his face. "Why don't you tell her you're someone important? If you were known, the institution might back down faster." Gabriel smiled, a small thing with a memory. He wanted to be honest on many levels, but some truths were weapons wearing a lace. "Because we're trying to build a life that isn't built on a headline," he said. "If she thinks of me as a celebrity, she won't know if I'm staying because I'm the man she needs or because of what I can give her. She needs someone who will exist in the plain facts her life can handle. Fame complicates everything." Claire considered him. She could be practical and stubborn in the same breath. She had seen too many people wrap charity in performative gestures and leave the mess behind. She understood, in a way that had nothing to do with fame, that anonymity could be an armor for those who needed to heal. At the center of their plans, a new problem took shape. The institution's director, a man named William March, sharp-featured, the type who smiled in a way that always left his teeth too clean, was not merely defensive, he was strategic. March's legal counsel sent a letter that read like a trumpet. Threats of charges for harboring a minor, suggestions of negligence against Claire's shelter for interfering with an official placement, and an undercurrent of something personal, a thinly veiled warning that whoever sought to shame his network would find the city's machinery ready to respond. Gabriel read the letter at the kitchen table. Claire's hands were folded, her fingers worrying the same seam of a napkin until it formed a seam of wrinkles. The letter suggested a logic they had known was possible. Take the regulator's word, turn an unauthorized rescue into a criminal case, and force the would-be saviors into the light where blame could be pinned. He looked at Leela, who sat coloring, not by simple choice, but because children are astonishingly skilled at pretending normalcy while holding their own small, private storms. "We'll need counsel," Gabriel said. "We'll need someone willing to push back and who can work with prosecutors if we get the right evidence. We can't be reckless, but we can't be cowed." Alex Reynolds, his lawyer, arrived with a briefcase and a look that implied he had combed through similar fights before. Alex had been a friend in the way that people become friends after seeing each other at the worst moments and choosing to come again. He listened to the case, read the letter, and folded his hands. "March is trying to do two things," Alex said. "He is attempting to frighten you into silence, and he is trying to create an appearance of legitimacy. We'll need notarized affidavits, documented chain of custody on the ledger and the payments, and corroboration from a licensed psychologist to show the children's statements have credibility and are not contamination." Dr. Priya Reyes, the psychologist Gabriel arranged to consult, had the steady voice of someone who had sat in rooms where children spoke their truths and then had to do the work of translating those truths into a format the law could use. She spoke gently with Leela and with the group, asking open-ended, non-leading questions. Leela drew pictures of a house with barely any windows and a small stick figure with a big shadow. She pressed the paper into Gabriel's hands, no explanation in her eyes, only a permanent smallness. "We document what the child says in the child's wording," Priya told them. "We avoid leading. We explain changes in behavior, signs of neglect,
poor nutrition, lack of immunizations, avoidant responses to physical touch. These are clinical markers. We also recommend immediate temporary placement with someone who can offer stability while we pursue the investigation. Everything depended on patience and precision, elements that would frustrate a man used to game clocks and physical intervention. Gabriel learned to be patient in new ways, with phone calls that took too long, with a bureaucrat who asked for one more form, with a journalist who wanted a skinny for a column and had to be redirected into an ethical cage. Jonah worked on multiple threads, pulling public records, attending hearings, but he never met Claire or Leela face-to-face in a way that compromised their privacy. He gave them short, anonymized updates and focused his reporting on the systemic problem, not the family. The first real shred of momentum came from an unexpected source, a bus driver's dash cam that had been quietly smuggled into Mira's laptop. The footage was grainy, blurred at the edges, and recorded on an off shift during winter. It showed small children being loaded into a van labeled with a corporate logo that, when traced, had recently been registered under a different name, a layer of obfuscation in a web of contracts. On the screen, under Mira's precise direction, a child that looked like Leela was led down the aisle with a woman whose face was blurred but whose hands were familiar, calloused fast. Mira digitized, time-stamped, and notarized the footage. Jonah began to open a careful public narrative that suggested investigation without identifying victims.
Alex filed a motion requesting county oversight and a court order for other potential victims to be safeguarded. Priya prepared declarations about the children's mental health needs. Gabriel organized people like a quarterback setting a play, but he did so without stepping into the center of the stadium. He gave interviews to Jonah only under the condition that quotes be anonymized and that the reporter accept an embargo until the authorities had a warrant. Allies clustered. A federal agent named Hayes, an enormous woman with quiet eyes who had been referred through a friend of Mara's, arrived with a courtly seriousness that made everyone else feel like they were finally moving toward something definite. Hayes explained the federal interest, trafficking charges and money laundering, if they could prove intent to profit from illegal care arrangements. She said what Gabriel had feared and needed. We can't make arrests absent probable cause. We do not move without a chain of custody. But with your evidence, and if we can get a warrant, we can escalate. The days folded into a rhythm of legal paperwork, tearful intake interviews, late-night strategizing, and simple, tender domestic moments. Gabriel watched Leela laugh once, the sound startling like sunlight. He learned the timbre of Claire's laugh and how to match it with an ordinary look that said, "I am staying." He learned how to be useful in small, daily ways, holding the little bowl steady for cereal, knotting a shoelace, staying quiet when someone needed to cry. Yet the presence of the outside world brushed their edges like cold wind. A redacted email about a possible whistleblower showed up in Jonah's inbox. There was a rumor, passing like a ghost, that someone at March's facility had been paid to keep quiet. Gabriel felt his old instincts stir. Defensive lines, protective formations. He worked the angles, who to call, what to hide, whose names to give, and which to smother in the feather of secrecy. He believed in a bank of named people who could act and shield, and he asked each of them to keep a lid over certain facts, his past included. He was not always kind to himself about it. There were moments in the late-night quiet when he would sit by the motel window and stare at the glass until it fogged with his breath. Faces from another life, crowds, a coach's shout, a father's proud nod, floated in and out of the same pain he now used to watch the city. He had the anomalous celebrity memory, boats of strangers celebrating him in a way that had nothing to do with the people in his hotel room. He had earned some of it with effort. He had lived the public persona because the world rewarded muscle and spectacle. Now, as he folded himself into a clandestine constellation, he weighed each public moment as a risk. His friends who knew his history, Mara, Alex, Jonah, felt the cost of secrecy too. One evening in the kitchen, Jonah leaned forward with a newspaper clipping folded between his fingers and a look that suggested the journalistic itch was not dead. "You can make a controlled release," Jonah offered carefully. "We name a benefactor. We spin a narrative where an anonymous donor funds a suit against a corrupt network. It gets public attention without you being the centerpiece. The optics would help. Resources mobilize that way."
Gabriel closed his eyes. He thought of his face blown up on a network show. Children asked to smile for the camera because a familiar face was good for ratings. No, he said. If I become the story, it changes how they see Lila and Claire. We need people to see them as people, not as parts of a celebrity rescue. Yet the threat grew. The institution's lawyer served a subpoena that sought documents, a fishing net meant to drag out any misstep. Gabriel's pulse climbed. The legal snares were not violent, but they were efficient. A single public record could turn a private attempt at care into a spectacle where the children were the currency. At night, lying awake, he thought of the cost to Claire. He knew from the way she folded his hoodie the first week that she had begun to rely on him. He knew the pattern of her morning, how she made coffee for people who could not always pay, how she kept a list of names in her head for those who needed a place to sleep. None of that was strategic theater. It was slow-pounding competency. He did not want to fracture the life she was rebuilding by dropping a bomb of fame at its foundation. Meanwhile, March began to move. A thin envelope arrived at Claire's shelter, slid under the office door like a drop in a dark well. Inside was a photograph, not of Gabriel, but of the motel's registration ledger with an address and a name that suggested someone was tracking the threads. March's lawyer sent a terse letter mentioning penalties and the consequences of interference. The tone warmed the edges of threat. Gabriel felt it like a tightening. In the old life, when the game clock zipped close, he would pace and plan in his head until the shape of the next play felt immovable. Here, plays were legal filings and human beings, not tactical rehearsals. He began to sleep less, train more, and rehearse perfectly ordinary gestures in the mirror so that Claire would never see the tension behind his jaw. And then, on a gray midweek, his phone vibrated with a number he trusted. Agent Hayes's voice came with a clipped assurance. "We can get a warrant on Friday if we can present chain of custody and credible eyewitness statements. We need an affidavit from the intake worker and a compiled ledger tie-in. Also, if there are any threats from March or materials that suggest they will intimidate witnesses, bring them forward." Gabriel folded his hands like a man about to take the field. He gathered the files, Mira's printed notes, Jonah's anonymized leads, Alex's legal motions.
Lila's coloring pages were tucked carefully into an evidence envelope because children's artifacts had become fragile proof. Claire sat across from him with her hands folded in a small, steady knot. She had not asked him about his old life again. She believed that what they were building existed in the quiet of bread, blankets, and bedtime stories. He wanted to keep it that way. "Friday," he said simply. It sounded like both a deadline and a promise. That evening, as he walked the narrow path by the river with the city light making a pale necklace on the water, Lila's small hand slipped into his. She hummed a nonsense song and tugged him to slow the pace. Gabriel let himself be pulled, thinking of the ways small hands anchor giant men. He listened as Lila said without looking up, "I like you, Daniel. You're not loud. I like quiet." He almost told her the truth. He almost let a name like a small betrayal slip out, so she would have a story that she could one day understand. He imagined her telling friends, years from now, about the man who had pretended to be her husband for the sake of a signature. Would she need the rest? Would she ever want to know the reason his shoulders moved with the memory of stadiums? He put the thought away. He was not willing to weaponize fame into a crutch for a child's future remade. Inside the motel, the television hummed news about a city council meeting unrelated to their case. The headlines ran like a river of other people's crises. He sat with a notebook and a pencil and practiced the things he would say about chain of custody, about the ledger and the bus footage. It was the odd dual life of a person who had once found his identity in public adoration and now measured himself by how quietly he could keep a secret that protected others. On Thursday night, a black SUV rolled to a stop outside Claire's shelter. Gabriel watched from the second-floor window as figures in suits stepped out, directionless at first, then purposeful. They were not the people from the agency. They were not court clerks.
A man's silhouette paused in the streetlight and turned his head as if listening for applause that would not come. Gabriel's breath caught. A camera snapped in the distance. Not a television camera, but a cell phone raised by someone who knew a story when they saw a man in a parking lot. For a minute, the city felt like a place that could collapse into noise. He stepped onto the street, told Claire to lock the doors, and moved with a gravity he had not practiced in the public eye. Mara was on the phone. Alex arrived with a stack of extra forms. Mira fetched the parole file she had acquired. Jonah called in a favor. A trusted broadcaster would not run anything that night. They moved like a team of people with hardened purpose. The moment required invisibility and yet demanded action. Gabriel, who had once announced plays into the roar of a stadium, now orchestrated small, almost invisible acts of defense.
The man in the suit, sharp, crisp, approached the door and asked softly for Claire Whitaker. He had a badge that looked too small for the threat in his voice. He handed a card with a name that did not belong to the city officials they had dealt with. March's marks were precise. The man smiled in the way men who thought money could tidy anything did, with the implacability of someone used to getting what he wanted. He told Claire there could be severe consequences for harboring a minor. He implied a lawsuit that would bleed funds and attention. Gabriel stepped forward, keeping his hands unfurled where they could be seen, the posture of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to protect. "This shelter is in compliance," he said. He did not use the name Gabriel. He was Daniel on the paper, Daniel in the eyes of the stranger who wanted to break their quiet. "If you wish to pursue legal action, come with a subpoena." The suit smiled in a way that suggested he had been waiting for a challenge. He left the business card on the desk and walked away. For a long period, the small room breathed with an exhale like a city settling. Claire sat down hard, and the children looked at the door as if the sound of walking might return in the middle of a nightmare. That night, Gabriel sat at the little motel desk with the envelope of bus footage and Mara's carefully redacted notes. He had not told Claire about the man who watched them from the streetlight. He would not. He promised himself he would shield her and Leela from the style of fight his fame brought. He would not let the press or the hungry courthouse make Claire's kindness into a public case study. Outside, a radio in a passing car carried the distant, droning music of someone else's life. Gabriel put his hand on the envelope like a benediction. There were winds to come. There were also dangers no amount of preparation could make comfortable. He had seen enough games to know that victory did not always look like glory. Sometimes it looked like a child sleeping through her first untroubled dream. He thought of the first promise he had ever made, never to let the clamor of his name be the shield for someone else's healing. He folded the paper under his arm and walked back to the shelter, where Claire read softly, Leela's head nested against her shoulder like something fragile finally allowed to rest. "We're going to do this," he said to them both, and the words were heavy with plans unsaid and futures not yet promised. "But we do it quiet, we do it right." Leela looked up, blinked through the pinprick of sleep, and smiled like a small lighthouse. "Are you my husband forever?" she asked without suspicion, the question shaped around a child's need rather than a legal term. Gabriel hesitated on an answer that might anchor a person for years, a kind of promise he had not intended to make, but which, once asked aloud, felt like the safest garment he could offer. "For now," he said, "and it would have to be enough." He did not tell her the full truth. That night he practiced words about custody and affidavits and the slow, patient work of convincing courts to see children as ends, not evidence. He did not say that being someone's husband in this fragile context meant standing between them and a world that could trade human beings for profit. He only held her hand and let the quiet in. In the morning, Agent Hayes called in the warrant. Her voice was the sound of something arriving, measured, bureaucratic, final. "We have probable cause," she said. "We will move in coordination with county services. We need your list of witnesses and a sealed chain of custody for all documents." Her next words were softer. "We will shield the children's identities.
We will not permit cameras in the vicinity of their shelter." Gabriel exhaled. The play had been called. They had done the work. He felt gratitude, curated and careful, for the people who had turned up and turned their skill to a small, crucial purpose. He felt something else, too, the old, familiar ache of a man about to turn a private initiative into a public process. He thought, briefly, of the way the crowd used to roar his name, how that single syllable could build or dismantle a life. He thought of the choice he had made, to exist now as a man named Daniel Hart to a woman named Claire and a child named Lila. He had not used his fame as a tool. He had instead invested his resources in a way that was functional but modest. Private investigators, a lawyer who owed favors, an anonymous fund that paid for emergency placements. He would remain a ghost in the public record. He told the allies who knew, no public images, no interviews from him, no visible connection to his old life. They agreed, each for their own reason, to the necessity of secrecy. The morning of the raid dawned thin and pale. They moved with precision. Agent Hayes' team, County Social Services, Mira with a pair of officers at her back, Jonah on standby with an ethical embargo, Alex with his legal packet sealed in a briefcase. Claire stood beside Gabriel with an expression that could be described as steady terror, fear honed by purpose. Lila clung to her hand. Gabriel's muscles hummed with the kind of readiness that belonged to other years, but now it was repurposed into a quieter violence, the energy of keeping a child safe. The warrant read like a summons to a war room. Names, timestamps, a list of addresses stitched together from the ledger and the bus footage. Gabriel folded the page and slid it into the envelope with an economy of motion that had been drilled into him by years of playing for keeps. He stood in the county operations van while Agent Hayes' team moved men and women into position. His hands felt normal, calloused, practiced, capable, and the ordinary steadiness of them calmed him more than anything else. They hit 3 locations before noon. The first was a warehouse converted into a temporary holding center where children were kept in shifts and paperwork was a currency. Officers moved like the tide, sharp, quiet, decisive. Mira shadowed the search teams with a badge and a temper that smelled faintly of righteous fury. Jonah stayed outside the perimeter with his phone turned off, waiting for the embargo to be lifted, eyes flicking across the courtyard as though cataloging the human cost of profit. Inside the warehouse, a child the age of Lila pressed her face to a pallet of folded blankets. She flinched when Boots entered the doorway, but when a woman with Hayes' badge crouched down and spoke in a voice that did not ask for permission, her shoulders unknotted enough for the officers to see the small, fine bones of neglect. Priya led the triage inside, notebooks and crayons in hand, drawing out simple details the way a gardener coaxes a plant into light. A nurse checked vitals, offered juice in small sips, and murmured for a blanket to be given twice as often. Gabriel watched from a metal stairwell, his posture a studied neutrality. He coordinated through Mara. Her voice in his ear was the sound of someone watching a chessboard in a flash, and through Alex, who was working to seal evidence packets. He had insisted, quietly, on being physically removed from the front lines that could end up on camera. He would not be the man who struck a pose on a courthouse step. He would be the one who paid for the buses and the legal filings and sat quiet at the back of hearings. But there were moments that required a human hand. At one point, a small boy, thin, wary, was found weeping behind a stack of crates. He would not come out. Gabe, in a neutral jacket and a voice that had become softer over these months, sat on the concrete with his knees against a rusted post and played with the knots of a shoelace. The boy watched, suspicious at first, then slowly reached out. When he put his hand on Gabriel's wrist, his fingers were cold but steady. He whispered like a small prayer, "Are you staying?" The simplicity of the question pinned Gabriel's chest with a tenderness that was almost violent. "Yes," Gabriel said, "I'm staying." They moved fast and messy, the good kind of messy that law enforcement can do when evidence is solid. Sealed envelopes, notary stamps, officers reading paperwork aloud. When officers pulled files from a locked office, they found shuffled invoices, a ledger with slashed-out payees, and a folder with receipts from a private clinic that didn't exist in anything other than a shell company. The wire trails led back to a web of corporations and laundered payments. Hayes's team radioed updates in clipped bursts. A county compliance officer signed a series of immediate orders to remove children and secure the building. It felt like victory, but Gabriel knew the long game had only begun. But there were moments that required a human hand. At one point, a small boy, thin, wary, was found weeping behind a stack of crates. He would not come out. Gabe, in a neutral jacket and a voice that had become softer over these months, sat on the concrete with his knees against a rusted post and played with the knots of a shoelace. The boy watched, suspicious at first, then slowly reached out. When he put his hand on Gabriel's wrist, his fingers were cold but steady. He whispered like a small prayer, "Are you staying?" The simplicity of the question pinned Gabriel's chest with a tenderness that was almost violent. "Yes," Gabriel said, "I'm staying." They moved fast and messy, the good kind of messy that law enforcement can do when evidence is solid. Sealed envelopes, notary stamps, officers reading paperwork aloud. When officers pulled files from a locked office, they found shuffled invoices, a ledger with slashed-out payees, and a folder with receipts from a private clinic that didn't exist in anything other than a shell company. The wire trails led back to a web of corporations and laundered payments. Hayes's team radioed updates in clipped bursts. A county compliance officer signed a series of immediate orders to remove children and secure the building. It felt like victory, but Gabriel knew the long game had only begun.
At the second site, they found a small medical clinic, more chemicals and less compassion than a place that cared for children should have. There were syringes thrown in a bin and a clipboard with names of children whose signatures were suspiciously similar. Priya's eyes softened when she read a child's scribbled name and then hardened as she cataloged the clinical signs of neglect. She prepared her statements in crisp, clinical paragraphs and reminded officers to speak to children in ways that would not artificially inflate memories. The third place was the most guarded, March's personal office, a tidy room where the anatomical coldness of paperwork lived next to a single leather chair and a rolled-up city map with certain neighborhoods circled. There was a moment there where a file drawer jammed, and an officer pried it open with the annoyed satisfaction of someone uncovering a secret. The drawer slid and revealed a neat stack of client contracts, transportation invoices, and a ledger that linked March's consulting company to a series of shell accounts. March's handwriting, sharp as a threat, was on several of the pages. When March himself was found at his private office, he was as composed as a man who had spent a lifetime buying patience. He smiled with the surgical politeness of someone used to choosing which part of a truth to give. The arrest was procedural. Cuffed, read his rights, escorted out with the sort of dignity that logistics give to men used to buying the rules. He said nothing that made sense as apology. When Hayes read the charges quietly into a recorder, a litany of money laundering, fraud, and negligent endangerment, it landed like a weight into the room. March's legal counsel moved quickly, issuing a calm statement that threaded deflection with righteous indignation. "We will vigorously contest these allegations," the statement read. They tried to frame the raid as overreach, an attack on a private organization doing necessary work. Jonah, given access to certain public filings and guided by Alex's requests, prepared a piece that put the facts into the context of a system that allowed profit to exceed care. The press wanted frames. Cameras hovered like flies. Jonah's embargo held because he believed in what Claire and the children needed. He ran a piece that spoke of systemic failure and anonymous community activists who had raised concerns. No faces, no name, only the ethics of exposure. Gabriel breathed out in a way that felt like relief and a small, private ache. The operation had succeeded because people acted on principle and because everyone kept to their promise to one child: anonymity. There was a quieter victory, too. When the children were moved into temporary protective care, they were given clean clothes, toothbrushes, new pajamas that smelled of citrus instead of antiseptic, and access to a counselor who offered the kind of immediate, gentle grounding that began to stitch a child's sense of safety back together. Leela tucked herself under blankets that had not been scavenged from storage crates, and for the first time since the rain, she slept without waking. The legal fallout was not immediate closure. It was contracts and hearings and depositions layered over weeks that would stretch into months. March's counsel filed motions designed to delay and obfuscate. They subpoenaed records that swept broadly, trying to find any misstep. Gabriel watched them hunt for errors like a predator searching for weakness. He watched Alex prepare counterfilings, requests to seal files, arguments for protective orders for witnesses, motions for expedited hearings on matters of the children's welfare. Alex's tempered fury and tactical mind were the kind of ally Gabriel had counted on, the person who understood the dance of ink and precedent. During a late-night meeting in the shelter's small kitchen, Jonah looked more worn than Gabriel had ever seen him look. "People want simple answers," Jonah said, stirring cold coffee. "They want a face to point to, a hero or a villain. But what we need is accountability with names and institutions on the record. We can put March on trial publicly without putting these kids in the spotlight." "No faces," Gabriel said, "and no glorification. We keep the children off the grid and we put the system on trial." They found more. As the weeks unspooled, Mira tracked financial flows into a discrete cluster of properties. A transport company had been paid to move children overnight, and the bills matched a series of invoices from a contractor who had been paid for logistics optimization. Jonah's careful reporting connected the dots without exposing the identities of the rescued children, and the public response was one of outrage toward an industry that had found ways to monetize vulnerability. Claire was both close and distant during this time in a way that Gabriel accepted with humility. She ran the day-to-day of the shelter, organized volunteers, took in calls about beds and food and legal paperwork, and kept her kindness calibrated for the blunt instruments of bureaucracy. She did not ask Gabriel about his past. She asked instead about evidence and custody and forms. He answered as Daniel, precise, patient, ordinary. And the ordinariness of his answers fashioned a trust that did not depend on spectacle. The pressure from March's camp had its own cadence. An anonymous email, heavy with insinuation, arrived at the shelter suggesting that the helper had resources that turned altruism into influence. It was a thinly veiled attempt to construct motive where none could be proven. Claire read it and sighed in a way that made Gabriel want to hold her gently. He did not, because holding her gently had to mean letting her make her own decisions, not cushioning every worry with his muscle. There was one hairline crack where exposure almost happened. A freelance photographer snapped a picture outside the county courthouse, broad angle, grainy light, and caught a figure in a jacket at the edge of a crowd. The photographer pushed the image to a gossip outlet with a hint. Is this the mysterious benefactor? Jonah moved quickly. He called the editor without asking for permission, pitched the ethics of publishing images that could identify child caretakers, and reminded the editor of professional standards. The outlet folded. The risk to their reputation outweighed any potential scoop. That night, Gabriel sat in the empty church cafeteria where they had set up intake services and let the news settle like dust. Claire brought him a cup of tea. She did not sit across the table as an ally in need, but as a friend who had brought someone a warm drink. "You did well," she said simply. "You helped them find safety." He thought of the small boy who had asked if he was staying, and the weight of that single question, a question that had become his private code. "We did the work," he said. "People showed up. That is the main thing." The legal process marched forward inexorably. Grand juries were convened, depositions took hours, and witnesses took long days to sort truth from fear. Priya prepared forensic statements that connected clinical markers of neglect with the children's testimonies. Alex presented them with the kind of rigorous punctuation judges respect. All the while, Gabriel kept to the margins. He testified in sealed sessions, never wearing anything that would signal his past identity. No flashy watch, no expensive suit. His voice was steady and unspectacular.
The judge granted protective orders for witnesses and narrowed testimony to necessary facts, not sensational details. The emotional axis of the story, Leela and Claire, remained their true north. Leela began to speak, at therapy, in quiet phrases that arranged her past into something that could be told without making it herself again. Once she held Gabriel's hand and brought him a crayon drawing, small figures around a house with a tree. She had labeled one figure husband and another guardian. She smiled up at him like someone making a claim. "Will you still be my husband forever?" she asked again, this time with the solemnity of someone who wanted to file hope away as a proof for rainy nights. "For now," Gabriel said, and the words carried more weight now that the legal world was inching toward clarity. He was preparing, with Alex, to file for guardianship in a way that would minimize public exposure and maximize stability. He did not want a temporary custody order to stretch into limbo. Children needed permanency.
There are hearings that are technical, full of procedural language, and lawyers who sound like streamers of legalese. There are other hearings that stop people in their tracks, the kind where a child stands on the witness box and looks out at the room full of adults and, in a small, clear voice, says the truth. Leela, with a counselor present and with Priya's prepped testimony at hand, did not give a theatrical performance. She told the court, in a voice that held fractures and healing at once, that she wanted a place to sleep and someone who would not leave when the night was loud. Gabriel felt the room tilt. The judge, older, precise, a woman who had played 40 years at the highest level of patience, listened with a cool face that softened only in the slanting light on a child's cheeks. Alex spoke in the language of law. Chain of custody confirmed, evidence corroborated, criminal charges pending, a request for the court to grant guardianship to a named petition because the child's best interest demanded continuity and protection. The opposition raised questions. Why not foster placement? Why not reunification? And Alex answered like a man who had seen the difference between a headline and a life. Claire sat beside him throughout the hearing, listening like a person hearing the pulse of something fragile and monumental. When the judge asked if she had a statement, she rose with a small piece of paper and read about what she had witnessed: the child who showed resilience, the shelter work that sought to protect rather than exploit, and an ordinary plea for the child's life to be steadied. She did not name Gabriel's fame. She did not need to. She spoke of a man who had been there and of a child's longing to belong. The judge's ruling was careful. The court granted guardianship to Gabriel under his legal name, Gabriel Mercer, on the basis that his living arrangement could provide a stable environment and that evidence suggested exploitation by institutional actors. The judge ordered March to be kept away pending trial and set a schedule for further hearings focused on restitution and systemic reform. Gabriel signed the documents with hands that did not tremble in any visible way. He felt the weight of the signature like the settling of an anchor. Claire reached for his hand across the table. She squeezed it with the small exhilaration of someone who had waded through a storm and found a place on the other side without drowning. After the hearing, there was a hushed moment in the hallway where reporters were cordoned off. A spokeswoman for the county released a statement acknowledging the court's actions and praising the cooperation of law enforcement and community partners. Jonah filed an ethical piece that emphasized systemic responsibility and the anonymous community actors who had made exposure possible. The public narrative was careful, focused, and protective of the children. Gabriel breathed as if he had run a marathon without the cameras. The next months were about repair and the slow work of making safety habitual rather than extraordinary. The foundation of advocates that Gabriel established, quiet, with a small board and a mission to support oversight and trauma-informed care, moved into action. It funded scholarships for mental health services, paid for court-appointed guardianships where needed, and underwrote audits of private contractors who worked with children. Its logo appeared on grants and legal filings. It never bore a face. Jonah wrote about the Foundation's role in catalyzing change without invoking any single benefactor. Alex arranged its financial scaffolding to protect donors' privacy. Leela started school in the neighborhood Claire had chosen, a small public school where the children were known by their teachers and not by any headlines. She learned to tie her shoes with more confidence. At home, she picked at the edges of fears the way a child might prod a sore until it softens. Priya continued to see her, and the therapist's office became a place whose walls bore stickers and quiet verdicts, patience, and the value of rebuilding trust. Gabriel slipped into the domestic life like a practiced habit. He cooked one evening a week, simple meals that did not require theatrics but which tasted like care. He learned which cereal Leela liked and how Claire took her coffee. He became the man who put a hand on the small of Leela's back as she climbed onto a chair to reach for a cookie. He learned, in small increments, the currency of ordinary love, showing up for school recitals, patching scraped knees, and increasingly allowing himself to be present for the vocabulary of the kind of family they were making. There were moments when exposure seemed possible. A local talk show producer called Jonah looking for an exclusive on the guardian who shook the city's institutions. Jonah refused. He arranged instead for a broad segment on systemic accountability that used anonymized interviews and no identifying footage. A viral post from someone who had been displaced by a shelter's closure mentioned a man who might be a former some kind of athlete in passing. The post was taken down within hours, too vague to prosecute but sufficient to make Gabriel's stomach twist. He called Mara and looked at her with an intensity that did not ask anything other than the hard truth. "People don't need to know," he said. "They need the system changed." Mara's eyes flickered like a dry match. "We keep it tight," she said. "We bury the threads. We won't let a rumor become a headline." There was one private moment, weeks after the guardianship was granted, when a social worker accidentally used Gabriel's athletic nickname in a conversation that she believed was private. The slip was like a pebble dropped into a still pond, tiny, barely audible, but the ripple could reach wrong shores. Fortunately, the social worker corrected herself mid-sentence and apologized with the candid shame of someone who had nearly betrayed a trust. Gabriel felt the pulse of alarm but chose not to flinch visibly. His allies tightened protective measures, redoubled their privacy protocols, and demanded that sealed records remain sealed. March's trial began with a procedural narrowness. Evidence was presented, witnesses droned into microphones, and corporate structures were parsed and torn apart by lawyers with plodding diligence. The city watched with a dull, righteous interest. The verdict was not immediate, but the court's process stripped power from the persona March had cultivated. The publicity focused on structural reform, audits, transparency protocols, and a cascade of policy changes that made life harder for organizations that sought to profit in the darkness. It was a slow bloom of accountability. In the quiet after the storm, Gabriel proposed a plan, a long-term guardianship that would give the children a permanent home if reunification with parents was impossible. Claire, always cautious about binding promises for people who had suffered the violence of uncertain attachments, took time to reflect. She walked the children in the park, made lists of questions in her head, and made sure her decisions were informed by the children's needs. One night, over a dinner of lean stew, Claire reached across the table and laid a hand on his. The small gesture carried more words than either of them spoke. "We have a life," she said, half-stated as if naming a fact might invite an inspection. "We do," Gabriel agreed. "It will be ordinary and small and imperfect." She looked at him, eyes searching for a softness that was never absent. "You're not loud," she said, as if that were either a surprise or a gratitude. "Thank you." He almost told her then the thing he had refrained from saying for months, the thing that could have made any conclusion of their story noisier with applause and paparazzi. He almost said that there had been stadiums and trophies and a life with bright public noise. He imagined the next sentence in his mind, the life he had given up so he might make this quieter one possible. Instead, he set the words down like an unspoken offering. "It's enough," he said. "We have what matters." There is a gravity to adoption hearings that few moments in a life can match. The weight of papers, the statutory language, the finality of signatures.
When Gabriel filed for adoption, the legal motion went through channels that were carefully curated by Alex. There were sealed records, redacted public filings, and a plan to keep the children's identities protected from public release. The court allowed the adoption to proceed with the necessary protective measures: in-camera testimony for sensitive parts, limited media access, and the court's commitment to keeping certain exhibits sealed.
On the day the adoption was finalized, Leela sat on Gabriel's lap in a smaller courtroom, clutching a small plush that had become ritual. The judge smiled as if she could see the arc of a life moving from fracture to wholeness. Claire raised her hand to the bench and pronounced what the rest of the world could not. She asked that this family be recognized, that the children's needs be placed at the center of the state's care. The judge signed the final order. A clerk stamped the document, and the motion found its legal conclusion. Outside the courthouse, a small sea of cameras waited, less hungry than before perhaps, or hungry but disciplined by Jonah's reporting. Jonah gave a short ethical statement on behalf of his piece, an articulation of systemic failure and community response. He quoted no names, he offered no imagery. In a separate file, he added links to resources for child welfare reform and for people who wanted to help. Gabriel watched from across the street, his profile a neutral outline against the urban stone. He felt something like completion and a small private exhale that tasted of tea and ash. They returned home, a small house Claire had insisted would be theirs. The mantel was bare of spectacle and full of small things: children's drawings, a chipped mug that had been Leela's house cup, a photograph of the first meal they had eaten together in that kitchen. Gabriel washed dishes that afternoon with the kind of focus one brings to ritual. He hummed an old line under his breath and thought of the ways a life could be quiet and vast at once. In the months that followed, Gabriel and Claire instituted a liturgy of ordinary care. Bedtime consisted of a story told in the shallow half voice of someone who loved the cadence of words. Breakfasts were early and shared. They celebrated small victories: Leela spelling her name correctly, a letter from a teacher saying she had begun to speak in class. Priya led family therapy that slid into routines: weekend parks, community volunteer days, and the occasional night out where someone watched the children so Claire and Gabriel could eat food that had not been prepared at a shelter counter. The foundation that Gabriel helped establish released a careful report on reform measures: audits of private contractors, tighter contracting guidelines, mandatory psychiatric screenings for staff working with vulnerable children, and a small grant pool for shelters that met trauma-informed care standards. The foundation's name never bore a face's fame. It simply existed, a quiet conduit for resources and policy pressure. Jonah wrote a follow-up investigating piece on the bureaucratic loopholes that had allowed the network to thrive, and the legislature responded with hearings shaped by the report's documentation. Change creaked forward with the obstinate velocity of institutions. There was one evening where the world almost cracked its bargain. A local sports program celebrated a reunion, and a talk show host reached out to Jonah about featuring a mystery benefactor who has been doing great work. Jonah refused. He told the host that the story was not for spectacle. The host, irritated, threatened to shop it elsewhere. Gabriel's allies mobilized: calls, polite legal reminders, and insistence on ethical standards, and the show backed down. It was a battle of small pressures, but the cumulative effect of those pressures preserved the shape of the family they had claimed. Years later, because restoration takes time, Leela grew into a girl who could tell a story without her past being the whole of her. She learned to swim in a municipal pool where triumphs were small and public in the best ways. She wrote lists of things she wanted to be, and she once told a classmate that her guardian did stuff for work and that he liked to make soup. She did not frame him as a myth, she framed him as home. Gabriel returned, in private, sometimes late at night, to the storage unit where boxes of his past life were kept under lock and legal paper. He would occasionally open a crate to check the certificates and the things one keeps as relics of younger ambition. They were not trophies in the way the world had once displayed them. No glitzy altars, no media kits, just artifacts carefully boxed and removed from the face of anything that would make them into propaganda. He kept them because forgetting his past entirely felt like a betrayal of the person he had been. He did not keep them to trade them for public affection.
There came a time when Gabriel had the choice to break the covenant of silence he had made in the months when anonymity had saved lives. A magazine, weeks away from printing, had acquired an unverified tip linking a benefactor to a public figure. Jonah, Mara, and Alex debated what to do. Exposing him would have made headlines. It would have guaranteed funding, attention, interviews, and perhaps easier pathways to systemic change. Gabriel sat at the table across from Claire and Leela and considered the weight of their faces, the ordinary configurations of sleep and breakfast and school forms. He imagined the press knocking at their door, the children being photographed in playgrounds, the slow metamorphosis of their home into a public case study. He thought of Leela's small hands and her question, "Are you my husband forever?" and how that had, over time, become both promise and covenant. He refused the exposure. He refused the headline that might have done rhetorical good but real harm. He chose the slow, stubborn work of a quieter life. He wrote a letter to the editor declining to comment if they had any intentions of putting the children in the frame. Jonah's piece ran as an expose on institutional failure and the grassroots that stop the worst abuses, and it did so without a single image of their family.
The piece directed readers to a donation page for trauma-informed care and a hotline for whistleblowers. People wrote checks and called legislators. The story affected change without costing the family their names. Years later, on an evening when the city's lights laid their soft shawl across the water, Gabriel read to the children on the couch. Leela was older, no longer a child in the way that frightened vulnerability marks youth, but still small enough to curl into his side. Claire traced a finger along the book's spine and hummed a lullaby she had learned as a child. The house smelled of cinnamon and the faint steam of a kettle that had been quiet a while. A sense of ordinariness filled the room like a blessing. "Tell the one about the night," Leela said, an old request that had taken on layers of meaning. Gabriel obliged and used the story to tell a parable of protection, a knight who swore not to fight for glory, but to guard a village that had no voice. He made sure the knight's valor came from work and care, not from trophies or applause. It was the story they lived if you listened carefully. Claire closed the book and looked at Gabriel, her expression folded with contentment and a deep, quiet trust that was the true prize of this life. She did not know the stadium roars and the trophies hidden in boxes. She did not need to. In this domestic world, fame would have complicated and perhaps broken the fragile architecture of their family. Gabriel had chosen privacy, the way some people choose a vow. Deliberately, humbly, and with the knowledge that love sometimes demands the sacrifice of recognition. "Are we forever?" Leela asked that night, the question a ritual candle they always lit together. "For now," Gabriel said, and then, with a steadiness he meant to keep for as long as he lived, he added, "And I will work to make that forever true." They sat in the quiet that followed, a litany of small noises, the turning of pages, the whisper of breath, the distant, soft city pulse, braiding the kind of ordinary life that could not be bought or manufactured. Outside, the city glowed and carried other people's headlines. Inside, a family stitched itself with the patient thread of daily rituals and legal permanence, with the added armor of allies who had kept a secret that saved children. The choice to remain unknown had been deliberate. Gabriel had traded public applause for the intimacy of remaining a single figure in a home's small history. A man who made soup, who taught a child to tie a shoelace, who sat through therapy appointments, and paid bills without a camera there to immortalize the gestures. Wherever his past had been spark and stadium chant, the life he built here was slow heat and steady light. If there is a final measure of justice in their story, it lives in the work that continued beyond them, in reform measures that made private profit from care more difficult, in grant-funded therapy centers that learned how to listen to the voice of a child without making the child a commodity, in volunteers who showed up because a community now knew how to ask better questions. The change was not enough to fix everything. No single human can claim that crown, but it was enough to bend one arc of cruelty toward accountability. In the hush of their living room, Leela yawned and settled against Gabriel's shoulder. Claire turned off the lamp. The house was a small, luxurious space of things that mattered. Shared food, the sound of a child's breath, the small groove in the couch where mornings were started.
Gabriel thought of the life he might have had if he had chosen noise. He thought of the life he had chosen to protect. He kept the thought private, the way people keep prayers that are not for sharing. He had become what the child had asked him to be in the rain, a person who would pretend long enough to make a life possible. He had stayed beyond the pretense. He had edited his past into privacy because the power of fame might have been a tool, but it would have been a blunt instrument for the fragile job of raising a child back to wholeness. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, the quiet family slept, wrapped in a permanence that had been argued for in courtrooms and earned in the small, sacramental routines of daily life. Gabriel held a small hand, and in that small, ordinary clasp, he felt a kind of redemption that did not need a crowd to validate it. He had pretended to be someone's husband so that a child could escape. Later, he had become, without fanfare, someone's father. If anyone ever asked why he had chosen to remain unnamed in the public record, he would have said, simply, plainly, that love needs room to grow without a spotlight. He would have said that the work of saving children required secrecy as a tool, and that sometimes the greatest courage is not to seek applause, but to sit quiet and steady in a life that protects others. A week after the adoption was final, Claire found a small envelope in Gabriel's handwriting on the kitchen table. Inside was a list he had written for himself: therapy referrals, a maintenance schedule for the shelter van, a reminder to check in with Priya about Leela's latest progress. There was no mention of a stadium or of any bright public life he once had. Claire smiled at the ordinary notes and folded them into a place on the fridge where the children's artwork lived. The paper warmed the magnet. The list became, in its way, a small map of ordinary duty. Years will teach what decades never could. Gabriel and Claire raised their children with the mundane heroism of people who show up. Gabriel coached a small youth soccer team, no publicity, no press, teaching kids how to pass and to look each other in the eye.
He taught them the difference between winning at someone's expense and playing to make teammates better. The children learned how to be a family that was not defined by headlines. And on quiet nights, when the house was full of the slow sounds of domestic peace, Gabriel stood on the balcony and looked at the city. He had once been known by a roar he could not now summon without breaking the home's fragile equilibrium. He chose not to summon it. He chose, instead, the small, steady music of a life made private in order to be public in the only way that mattered, by protecting those who could not protect themselves. If this story has a final image, it is not a press conference or a trophy case. It is a family reading a book at bedtime, the pages turning slowly while the world outside stacks headlines into the night. It is a woman who does not know a man's famous past because she never needed to. She knows him by the warmth of his hand and the constancy of his coming home. It is a child who asked, in the rain, for a pretend hug, and, years later, holds it as a real thing, a life made from a promise and kept by ordinary, unglamorous love. If you have been moved by this story, consider learning more about ways to support child welfare organizations and trauma-informed care in your community. Sharing this story with someone who cares about children can help keep the conversation going and support real, practical change.